Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All Secrets Keep or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lisbeth_1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Celine.
All Secrets Keep, Chapter 13. It was early when Sarah woke the next morning, early enough that Telly didn't have to be up for first bell yet. She was thankful that she didn't have to wake Telly yet, content to simply lie in bed next to her and watch her sleep. Telly's red hair was splayed out across her pillow as she lay on her back, snoring gently. It really was painfully adorable, Sarah thought with a smile. She slid her leg out from between Telly's and stretched as she stood, feeling the pleasant soreness in her muscles from the previous night as she did so. Telly had been understandably nervous when it came to returning the pleasure that Sarah had given her, but Sarah had assured her that she would enjoy it regardless of whether Telly made her come or not. Telly had been determined, though, and what she lacked in experience, she made up for in enthusiasm, sending Sarah over the edge in a messy but powerful orgasm that had her toes curling. Telly had also been delighted to find Sarah's witch's mark, a shiny, red, flowery mark on her right hip that Telly had promptly leaned down and kissed, scraping her teeth over the sensitive skin. Leaving Telly sleeping peacefully in her bed, Sarah crossed the room to the adjoined bathroom and stepped into the shower, turning the water on. She had barely finished washing her hair when she heard the bathroom door open, and she pulled the shower curtain aside, just enough to peer out. Telly, still completely naked, stumbled sleepily into the bathroom. Her eyes looked as if they were still half closed as she stepped into the shower with Sarah, immediately wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist, resting her head on Sarah's chest. Sarah stroked her hand down Telly's hair. "My love, what are you doing awake? It's still very early. You don't need to be up yet." "You weren't in bed," Telly replied, her voice still laced with sleep. She shivered lightly under the spray of water, and Sarah reached over to adjust the temperature of it. "I was going to come back." Sarah couldn't help the softness that crept into her voice as she spoke, something that always seemed to happen when she was around Telly. Telly just hummed in response, and Sarah was certain that Telly would fall asleep leaning against her if she let her. She reached behind her, grabbing Telly's wrists and unwrapping the younger woman's arms from her. Telly let out a slight whine in protest as Sarah gently moved her a step back so that she was standing under the water. "Just stand still," Sarah ordered gently. Telly just nodded, closing her eyes as she stood under the warm spray of water. Sarah picked up the shampoo and began to slowly work it into Telly's hair, staring at her as she did so. She wasn't sure how she had gotten so lucky after everything they had been through, for Telly Craven to come back to her, to love her. She had been certain that after everything Telly had found out about her past, about Liberia and about Nicta, that any sort of relationship, platonic, romantic, or otherwise, would have been out of the question. She had never been so happy to be wrong about anything in her life. It had surprised her, the intensity of her feelings for Tally, ones she didn't even realize she had been harboring, until Anacostia had told her Tally had gone on a mission with Nicta. They had all come crashing forward then, bursting forth like water from a dam, and what had surprised Sarah even more was that they didn't scare her. In all her years in the army, she had always tried to avoid romantic relationships. They only served to make things more complicated, especially given the fact that there would have always been a power imbalance with her in the position as general. But as she had grown closer to Tally over the weeks they spent together, she had found herself reconsidering that stance, but always holding herself back out of uncertainty. It wasn't until Anacostia and Isadora had questioned her, had pushed her, did she actually allow herself to consider what it might be like to pursue a romantic relationship with Tally. It was the best decision she had ever made. She was sure of it. Sarah tilted Tally's head back, starting to rinse the shampoo from her hair, running her fingers through the long locks. Tally smiled sleepily at the sensation, eyes still closed, and Sarah, unable to help herself, pressed a tender kiss to Tally's forehead. She loved Tally Craven in a way she wasn't sure she had ever loved anyone before, and even though she knew it wasn't feasible, that someday Tally would graduate from War College and get deployed, Sarah knew in her heart that she would do everything in her power to make sure that Tally was safe, and that she always felt loved. A sob suddenly tore from Tally's lips, and Sarah looked at her, alarmed. Her eyes quickly raked up and down Tally's body, as if she expected to find some sort of injury that had caused Tally to cry out. Finding none, she looked back up to see Tally staring at her, with her eyes wide open, tears mixing with the water from the shower. "Darling, what's wrong?" "I can feel you," Tally whispered, as she began to tremble, despite the warm water she was standing under. "I can feel what you're feeling." Her words froze Sarah in place. "You can?" "Yes," Tally let out another sob. "I can feel what you're feeling, how you feel about me." Sarah just stared at her in shock, unsure of what to say or do. "I felt it last night too. I just didn't know what it was right away." Tally was staring up at her, eyes wide. "It was like this tugging sensation in my chest, but now—" Tally swallowed, hands reaching out to brace herself on Sarah's arms. "I could feel you so clearly. It was like this warmth Her brown eyes were staring desperately into Sarah's. "I've never felt love like that before in my life." Her last words came out a whisper, almost sounding like a plea. But what she was asking for, she didn't know. Sarah very shakily swallowed, slowly gathering Tally into her arms and pulling her flush against her as she felt tears appear in her own eyes. Tally clung to her desperately. "I've never loved like this before." The first thing that Nicta became aware of when she finally woke up was pain. A dull pain seemed to radiate throughout her whole body, and when she slowly creaked her eyes open, wincing at the sharp light, she let out an involuntarily groan of pain. "Oh shit, you're awake." A familiar yet unexpected voice came from her right, and Nicta sat up slightly, her body protesting in pain as she turned her head from where she was laid out on a bed to look at Abigail. "Little bells?" She didn't bother to hide the surprise in her voice, and she coughed after she spoke, her throat dry. "What the hell are you doing here?" She then looked away from Abigail to take in her surroundings. "And where is here?" "You're in the Fort Salem infirmary, a private room usually reserved for high-ranking officers." Abigail's answer took Nicta by surprise, and she turned back to look at her. What? My mom didn't think it would be a good idea to have public enemy number 1 out in the front, where just anyone could walk by and see her. Abigail smiled wryly. Nicta gestured to her face. Does that mean I'm myself again? The smile disappeared from Abigail's face. Yeah, Colonel Wick said you came really close to dying and that your body must have automatically stopped the working to save your energy. Ah, Nicta clicked her tongue. I see. Neither of them spoke for a while until Nicta posed her original question again. That doesn't explain what you're doing here, though. I mean, no offense, but I didn't think you would be the one to sit with me while I'm recovering. Abigail arched an eyebrow. And who were you expecting? Nicta settled back against her pillows with a grimace. No one, really. Abigail shifted in her chair, so she was sitting up straight. My mom didn't want you to wake up alone. She was with you for a while, but she had some stuff she needed to take care of, and she asked me to stay with you for a bit. Oh. Nicta wasn't sure why, but her heart was suddenly beating faster. Speaking of, Abigail stood up from her chair, Nicta turning to look at her as she did. She asked me to tell her whenever you woke up. I guess there's still some stuff she wants to talk about with the mission. She made it to the door and had opened it slightly when she suddenly slammed it closed again, whirling around to face Nicta. Why did you do it? She demanded. What? Why did you take that knife from me? Abigail stepped closer to the bed. I've been trying to wrap my mind around it, but it doesn't make any sense. You have no reason to like me. The last time we saw each other before that mission, I had been sent to capture you. You almost get executed because of my actions, and then you risk your life for me? Abigail was dangerously close to yelling. Hey, keep it down. Nicta struggled to sit up. Do you really think I'm that shitty of a person that I'm gonna let a kid get stabbed when I'm leading a mission she's on? I'm not a kid, Abigail said defensively. I'm a soldier. Getting hurt is part of the job. And plus, I don't know anything about you. You're a terrorist who forces people to kill themselves. You could be that shitty of a person for all I know. Nicta set her jaw, her dark eyes glinting as they stared at each other. Abigail may have had a point, but that didn't mean Nicta had to like it. Well, I'm not, she said tightly. Besides, your mom saved my life when she set me free. I wasn't gonna let her only daughter get hurt, not when there was something I could have done about it. She scoffed then. Are you really mad at me 'cause I saved your life? No, of course not, Abigail said defeatedly. She looked like she was going to say something else, but she shook her head instead. I'm gonna go tell my mom that you're awake. Nicta settled back against the pillows, propping herself up with them. And tell her to bring some food with her. I'm fucking starving. Abigail gave her a very pointed eye roll as she left the room. There was no clock in the room, so Nicta had no idea how much time had actually passed between Abigail leaving and Petra arriving. But as the minutes ticked by and she sat alone in the room, her palms began to sweat, and she found herself waiting anxiously for Petra's arrival, stomach twisting. She blamed it on having almost died. She wasn't sure what exactly she could blame on the way that her heart seemed to briefly jump into her throat when the door finally opened, though, or the way she sat up straighter when Petra entered the room. She wiped her sweaty palms on the blankets. Bells. Nicta. Petra stood at the foot of her bed, crossing her arms. She looked Nicta up and down. How are you feeling? Tired, Nicta answered truthfully. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so exhausted. Sore. Petra nodded. Colonel Wick said you would probably feel that way for a while. She stopped the bleeding and fixed all the internal injuries, but you lost a lot of blood, and only time and rest will fix that. Nicta cocked her head. I told little Bells to tell you to bring me food. Petra rolled her eyes, an image that reminded Nicta very strongly of Abigail. It's on its way. Nice to see that a near-death experience hasn't motivated you to lose any of that snark. Nicta smirked. It's part of my charm. Petra let out a bark of laughter. Oh, is that what you were calling it? A fleeting smile crossed Nicta's face, and she met Petra's gaze. What would you call it then? Petra's smile disappeared, and the two women stared at each other for a moment, until Petra cleared her throat and looked away. Abigail told me what happened. Nicta suddenly felt very nervous. In regards to what? She told me about the push bomb, how your agents used it, not knowing if the girls would be affected or not. Petra looked back at her, an unreadable expression on her face. Nicta's throat went dry. Now hold on, Bells, she said quickly. I told them, my agents, I told them not to bring any. I didn't want to risk it. I didn't know they brought any along, I swear. I know. Petra's gaze seemed to soften, if only a fraction. She told me how angry you were afterwards. She unfolded her arms and crossed the room to sit down in the chair Abigail had been in when Nicta first woke up. I admit I was a little hesitant about sending them with you at first. Nicta didn't say anything. I wasn't sure if I could trust you, not completely anyway. Not with my daughter, at least. Petra looked down at her hands. My daughters. Nicta remained silent, sensing Petra wasn't done speaking. But you protected them, better than I ever could have asked of you. Petra finally returned to looking at Nicta, gratefulness written all over her face. Nicta swallowed, hard. You risked your life for Abigail. You refused to let Raelle even try to heal you, because you knew she was already at her limit. Petra stood up, smoothing her jacket as she did so. We may have our differences, Nicta, but I will forever be grateful for what you did for them, and forever in your debt. Petra... I have to go, Petra interrupted her. I have a very important matter to take care of today. You're welcome to stay here as long as it takes you to recover. Colonel Wick will be by later today to check on you. Nicta didn't even have the chance to say anything before Petra had fled the room. It wasn't long after Telly left for first bell that Sarah heard her door open again. She glanced back over the shoulder of the couch she was sitting on and frowned when she saw Petra Bellwether standing inside the doorway. "Hello, Sarah," Petra said easily. She looked entirely too pleased with herself. "Petra," Sarah stood up, straightening herself to her full height. "What are you doing here?" "I have good news," Petra said easily. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" She wondered if this good news had anything to do with Telly's mission the other night. "Anacostia told me that she already informed you about the mission to the Camarilla base, so I won't waste either of our time telling you things you already know about." Petra's tone was crisp, and something about the way she spoke held Sarah's attention. "But rather I will tell you the decision that Anacostia and I came to, a decision that was only made possible because of that mission." Sarah's breath caught in her throat at Petra's words. She didn't want to get her hopes up, and yet she found herself hoping anyway. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" A supremely smug smile appeared on Petra's face. "Yes, it is finally time to let the world know that Sarah Alder is still alive." Telly reached out and snagged the elbow of her coven leader. "What the hell is this press conference about?" "Your guess is as good as mine," shrugged. "All I know is that General Bellwether called for an emergency press conference, but I don't think anybody knows what it's about. I heard some higher-ups talking about it too. None of them have any idea." "This is so weird," Abigail whispered in Telly's ear as walked away. "Do you think this has anything to do with the Camarilla base?" Tally turned to look at Abigail. The two of them, along with Rael and several other covens, were all crowded in a common room, surrounding a TV. Earlier that day, Petra had announced that there would be a press conference held after dinner, and everyone had rushed from the mess hall to the common room. Maybe, Tally glanced around the room, from where they sat on the couch in front of the TV. It was almost full, but a movement in the doorway caught her attention as her eyes landed on Anacostia, beckoning to her. She frowned. "Hey, I'll be right back." "What?" Abigail looked at her. "It's about to start." "I know. I'll hurry." Tally squeezed Rael's knee as she stood up. "Save my seat for me." Rael coughed casually, slouching back and slinging her leg up into the spot where Tally had been sitting. Tally pushed her way through the throng of people crowding the room, towards Anacostia. Once she was close enough, Anacostia reached out and grabbed Tally's wrist, all but dragging her outside into the hallway. "Craven, when was the last time you spoke to Alder?" she asked in a low voice, not even bothering with a greeting. She had a serious look on her face. Tally frowned. "Sarah? I saw her this morning." "What time this morning? How early?" Anacostia pushed her. "Before first bell." "Goddess," Anacostia breathed out. She looked over Tally's shoulder into the crowd of people. "So you don't know then?" Tally was starting to get worried. "Okay, Anacostia, you're starting to freak me out. What's going on? Is Sarah okay?" Anacostia closed her eyes for a brief second. "This press conference." She opened her eyes as she spoke. "Petra is announcing that Alder is alive." Tally's eyes felt like they were going to pop out of her skull. "What?" She hadn't meant to yell the word, and several people from inside the room turned to look at her. Anacostia grabbed her by the wrist again, dragging her out of line of sight of everyone. "Petra thinks that the success that you guys had at the Camarilla base is enough of a victory to safely bring Sarah out of hiding." "You don't agree with her?" Tally asked. Anacostia hesitated. "I don't know," she said truthfully. "It's good for Alder, so that she doesn't have to hide away anymore and can go back to living her life like, well, as normal as it can be, but part of me just feels like it's too soon. Like we're not even waiting to see how taking down the base affected the Camarilla. She's just assuming that it's safe to." "Well, for Sarah's sake, I hope she's right." Tally twisted her hands nervously. "I mean, you don't think the Camarilla will attack Fort Salem again, do you?" Anacostia pursed her lips. "No, I don't think so. I mean, you definitely did succeed in taking them down a peg." She sighed, frustrated. "Maybe I'm just being overly cautious. I should trust Petra's judgment." "Tally!" Abigail's voice sounded from the doorway, and had both women turning to look at her. "It's about to start. Come on!" "Okay, I'm coming." Tally nodded goodbye to Anacostia, and followed Abigail back into the room. She was suddenly very nervous. She sat down between her two sisters, palms beginning to sweat. On the TV, Petra approached the podium, and cameras from the crowd began to flash. The room behind Tally fell silent. "As you all know, several months ago, the Camarilla attacked us, here, in our home of Fort Salem. They were eventually pushed back, but not before we lost several of our sisters, our daughters. Among these casualties was Penelope Silver, the daughter of the vice president, tragically used as a weapon against her own sisters, and the great General Sarah Alder." Petra paused at this, giving her words time to sink in. "The Camarilla took General Alder's death as a victory. They had hunted her for centuries, since the very founding of Fort Salem, and viewed her death as a victory to gain a foothold in this war. Is this like a memorial or something for Alder? Raelle whispered. She was instantly shushed by Abigail and Tally, and she rolled her eyes. Tally's heart was pounding. She couldn't tear her eyes from the television, not wanting to miss the moment that Sarah appeared on the screen. Well, here, today, we are going to take that victory back from them. Whispers started traveling around the room, behind them, and Tally felt Abigail and Raelle exchange a confused glance over her shoulder. There were several shocked gasps that came from the reporters and journalists on the TV, and the camera panned to Petra's left, where General Alder had entered the room. Tally forgot how to breathe as she looked at Sarah on the TV. She had gotten so used to seeing Sarah with her hair down and in civilian clothing that she had forgotten just how formidable, how striking that Sarah looked as the general. Her hair was pulled back into her signature braid, and she was wearing the general's uniform, looking exactly the same as she had before she died. The only difference was her medals, wearing the pins of a 4-star general instead of the 5 that Petra now wore. Holy fucking shit. Tally dimly heard Raelle curse next to her. She reached out and grabbed each of her sisters by their hands, squeezing them. Sarah approached the podium, the camera following her, and Petra stepped aside to let Sarah take her place. The whole room, both on and off TV, seemed to be still, everyone holding their breath. Sarah tilted her head. I will now take questions. Her voice seemed to break the stupor everyone had found themselves in at her appearance, and both rooms exploded into chaos.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.